Won't somebody think of the children? Play the role of substitute parent with Doki Doki Penguin Land and Drol on Segaiden. At last we come to one of the crown jewels of the SG-1000, Doki Doki Penguin Land. One of the few original creations for this console to make its way to future platforms, Doki Doki Penguin Land has depth and nuance to spare. Certainly enough to make it more than just the mere Lode Runner clone it appears to be at first glance. This game may look familiar even to the Nintendo kids who never owned a Sega system, and that's for good reason. We've already seen the sequel to Doki Doki Penguin Land, called simply Penguin Land, over on Game Boy Works. Really, I don't even know if you could properly call Penguin Land for Game Boy a sequel, since the two games make use of nearly identical mechanics and premises. It's more that the Game Boy release reworked the content of the earlier game into portable form, tweaking stage layouts and shifting around some of the gameplay details. The older SG-1000 title will still feel instantly familiar to handheld aficionados. It will also feel familiar to Sega aficionados, since Penguin Land appeared on Sega Master System in the US. As with Choplifter, that later 8-bit release was not completely identical to the SG-1000 version, boasting reworked graphics and other small refinements. Unlike with Choplifter, the overhaul wasn't entirely necessary. Although Doki Doki Penguin Land here does work under the graphical limitations of the SG-1000 with single-colored sprites and a minimal color palette, it really doesn't feel like an SG-1000 game in the usual sense of the word. No, this feels like the kind of game that comes to mind when someone says Sega game. It contains tons of depth, its controls are absolutely excellent, and the central puzzle mechanic, rolling an egg down through a gauntlet of hazards, plays out with remarkable subtlety to its physics. Doki Doki Penguin Land gives players tons of control over their character's movement, particularly when it comes to jumping and nudging the egg. This is without question the best and most nuanced thing to have appeared on SG-1000 since FLICKY, although it moves at a far slower pace. As in FLICKY, you're protecting a child, or an egg, from roaming predators on the prowl for a meal. Your task as a father penguin is to make Morgan Freeman proud by safely navigating your egg past a ravenous pack of polar bears, down a series of caverns, and to the security of your living room, where your avian life mate awaits. The egg can safely drop only a certain distance without cracking, and it's simultaneously a crush hazard. Land directly atop the egg and you will still your own child's developing heartbeat. Very grim. This makes for a very demanding game, but Doki Doki Penguin Land gives as generously as it demands. Unlike a lot of SG-1000 games, the collision detection and object interaction here afford you a lot of nuance and subtlety rather than operating in fixed tile-based increments. For example, you can drop onto the egg from above without crushing it, provided you drop off-center. Instead of turning your kid into quiche, you'll simply nudge the egg a few pixels away from you. This means that, unlike in the upcoming Sokoban, pushing your burden against a wall doesn't mean you've completely failed the puzzle at hand. It just means you need to hop over the egg again and wedge your penguin pal between the wall and his unborn infant. Likewise, enemies operate under a variety of different behaviors, with the polar bears in particular being quite vexing in the way some will go into a bit of a frenzy when they get a whiff of a tasty future hot scramble, while others will simply plod along inexorably. However, there is no explanation forthcoming about how these Arctic creatures end up in the Antarctic. Another creature, a sort of mole thing I guess, exists to keep you on your toes. It won't get too close to Papa Penguin, but should you leave your young charge on its own for too long, the mole will snatch it away and make a mad dash off-screen, presumably headed for its kitchenette. We've seen a lot of Bruderbund's Lode Runner in this era of Famicom and SG-1000 games, but Doki Doki Penguin Land strikes me as the first game that has made an earnest attempt to build on Lode Runner's principles. The digging and dropping mechanic, which allows you to break through a tile of ground one space for where your penguin protagonist stands, comes directly from Lode Runner. You even have to make use of Lode Runner's antlion effect, in which digging downward through multiple layers of ground requires you to begin with a wide opening that narrows as you descend. But Doki Doki Penguin Land does more with its use of the digging concept than simply expect you to evade enemies. The introduction of an escort mission mechanic, if you will, demands a new layer of tactical thinking. Success here is less about simply making a frantic dash to grab items while luring robots to their doom than it is about plotting out a path for your egg and accounting for the dangers that emerge along the way. Likewise, you counter the predations of the wildlife here externally as well, dropping or shoving blocks onto foes to crush them. As in Lode Runner, Doki Doki Penguinland escalates in difficulty pretty quickly, and it allows you to start from any one of its 25 stages at the outset of the game, rather than forcing you to grind through the early levels over and over again each time you play. It's challenging, demanding you manage both the physical environment and the creatures that inhabit it as you seek a path to practice best egg safety. This is the 8-bit Sega Americans know from the Master System. It's a game that offers depth, challenge, great refinement, and ultimately, total fairness. It's a real high point for the SG-1000, and a game that would deservedly live on throughout the 8 and even 16-bit eras. Would you believe another Bruderbund PC game makes its way to SG-1000? Drol may well be the most obscure title Sega ever licensed from the West, but the game earned its place here on SG-1000 thanks to its personal importance to Sega's own development staff. Originally released for Apple II in 1983, Drol either riffed on Namco's MAPPY, which first appeared in arcades in early 1983, or else represents a startling, independent, evolutionary convergence of creative gameplay concepts. As usual for a Bruderbund game, Drol gives its designer a credit on the title screen, one Benny Ik Beng No. Unlike, say, your Doug Smiths or Will Wright, finding concrete information about No online is a bit of a challenge. An Atari Age forum post from last year claims No was a college student at the time of Drol's release, and also that Drol is Dutch for turd, I suppose in keeping with Bruderbund's naming tradition, where Bruderbund means band of brothers in Dutch. Even if Drol didn't take its inspiration from MAPPY, and I'm pretty sure it did, it's very much a game of a specific moment in time, and that time was 1983. It incorporates elements from a number of games that had been huge in the very recent past, including the incorporation of a Defender or Rally X style radar screen, which had previously been seen on SG-1000 in SINDBAD Mystery. The early days of video game evolution were really all about designers getting hooked on a game, adopting their favorite ideas for their own game, and in the best cases, adding new ideas and inspirations to those works. Drol definitely appears to have borrowed plenty of concepts from the big games of the early 80s, but it in turn exerted its own influence on others. Specifically, it inspired Sega's Yoji Ishii. The presence of a game as obscure as Drol on Sega's console can probably be accounted for by the fact that it was a personal favorite of one of the company's top designers. In a 2014 GameSide interview, localized by Shmuplations, Ishii cited both Defender and Drol as major influences on FLICKY. So it makes perfect sense that the game that helped inspire one of the best titles on SG-1000 would also appear on SG-1000 itself, even if it's not as good as the game it helped bring to life. To put it in hashtag relatable terms, Sega publishing Drol is kind of like Lady Gaga bringing Tony Bennett on stage, or in old people terms, David Bowie singing Christmas carols with Bing Crosby. This really does seem like a game that hit SG-1000 out of a sense of fondness and personal interest. Which isn't to say Drol is bad, it's just not as good as FLICKY. You can definitely see the connections between the two though. Drol involves rescuing children from a maze of hazard-packed platforms. The kids don't trail along behind you, but the spirit of good parenting is there. Or good nannying, I guess? Drol stars a sort of robot daycare assistant, a la Rosie from the Jetsons, or Herbie, the Fantastic Four's cartoon stand-in for the Torch. Drol moves slowly and precisely as a robot does, while surrounded by fast-moving hazards. This makes for a game that is quite a bit less exciting and less fluid than FLICKY, demanding a high degree of precision, threat management, and maybe a little bit of an ability to predict the future. Each stage consists of multiple floors that Drol needs to traverse, and the robot can switch between them at key points marked by doors by pressing up or down once it reaches those hatches. Shifting to a different floor has the side benefit of shaking off pursuers or hazards, such as clinging magnets. So maybe Dragon WANG belongs to the list of Sega games influenced by Drol as well. Drol can face forward and backward, turning methodically between orientations, and it can either walk or hover. Because Drol turns so slowly, you can't easily turn to blast a pursuer with Drol's nanny lasers, which adds greatly to the challenge. Changing altitude also happens at something of a measured pace, but in this case, the slow speed of Drol's movements actually works in your favor. Drol can fire projectiles straight ahead against enemies and other projectiles, which attack at 3 levels, high, low, and medium. You can fire a low shot while walking and a high shot while hovering. However, you can only hit enemies at the middle altitude by firing in the split second in which you make the transition between walking and hovering, or vice versa. Each phase of Drol takes place across 3 levels, each of which ends when you perform your requisite rescue. In the first stage, you need to rescue a pet, alligator, I think. Once you've saved the runaway creature from marauding chickens, a child appears chasing a balloon. Collect the kid and you move along to stage 2, where the goals are reversed. You rescue a child first, and then the alligator or whatever that is. Stage 3 is the equivalent of a boss stage, where you no longer have to pursue scampering swamp predators or balloon-chasing urchins. Instead, you simply need to make your way to the bottom right portion of the stage to save a blonde lady who's been tied to a post by a villain clad in a voodoo mask. Yeah, there's a bit of jungle savage imagery in Drol that isn't totally palatable these days, but the good news is that the simple, single-color sprites the SG-1000 generates tend to abstract the details enough that the dated ooga-booga quality of the enemy designs fortunately doesn't come through. The final rush to the end of Stage 3 involves traversing long hallways as you're bombarded by an overwhelming spray of projectiles. Arrows rain at you in sets of 3 at different heights, while random swords streak across the screen when you least expect it. The radar display in the corner of the screen depicts enemies, but not projectiles, making it largely useless for the final stage. It's a tough game and decidedly dated among its peers here in 1985, but you can still see the fundamental appeal of the action, and you can't help but respect the fact that Sega chose to pay it a tribute of sorts by enshrining it in their pantheon of first-party releases in the SG-1000 days. Given the way Drol has otherwise largely vanished from history at this point, I suppose this almost qualifies as an early attempt at game preservation. Next time on Segaiden, we got the Doki Doki, now comes the panic.